Covering Warhammer can very quickly lead one into a bit of a conundrum. On the one hand, variety is the spice of life, and it's always enjoyable to branch out a bit. Keeps things fresh for the viewer and interesting for me. On the other hand, I enjoy making more than $0 a month, and so must eventually bend the knee to Lord James and his workshop and talk about Spehhs Muhrines. There's just no escaping it. So today I will do my part and do just that, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there's a lot of Spehhs Muhrines out there. Officially, there's 1,000 chapters more or less, which means at minimum we got 1,000,000 Marines out there. That's not a lot galactically speaking, but it's still a lot of groups of goobers. And today we're going to talk about some of the less prominent ones. Not necessarily lesser known, but the ones that are off to the sidelines more often than not. No talk of Ultramarines and Blood Angels here, we're off to the fringes today. After all, while the narrative importance of the major legions and some successor chapters means they get most of the attention and best narratives, the ones to the sideline make the setting feel full. In a universe this big, we need people that are just around in the sidelines, and the Spehhs Muhrines we'll talk about today are just that. Maybe they're fairly active and still occasionally show up in modern day lore. Maybe they don't really do too much, but they still pop up once in a blue moon to say hello. And maybe, just maybe, they're from a single White Dwarf article and have never reappeared since. All and more are welcome, so sit down and get ready for yet another dose of Spehhs Muhrine slop. But before I start yammering on, I'm gonna make an assumption about you. You eat food. And because you eat food, I've got just the thing for you. Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is a meal delivery service that sends chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and most importantly, delicious meals straight to your front door. I do not like leaving my house for shopping. I know I have to sometimes, I know it just has to happen, but I and probably most of you don't like going shopping for food and whatnot. Well, with Factor, that's a thing of the past. No more shopping trips, no cook prep, no cleanup beyond throwing the tray in the garbage. Just 2 minutes in the microwave, and you're good to go. And it's got plenty of other meal options for you to choose from as well. Breakfasts, smoothies, and some juices I can personally vouch for are all some of the options for you to enjoy. Since a proper sleeping schedule is well beyond me at this point, I like to have some Factor at night. When dinner time for me is most people's time to wake up, it's nice to know that Factor is my back when it's time to chow down. And if you too would like a nice Factor meal, I've got just the thing for you. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50pancreas to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50pancreas at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. If you want to get some good grub or just want something quick to chow down on, you can do no better than Factor, so use my link so you can get yourself some of the finest food out there. Now then, let's see what the B-listers are up to. There's not really any proper criteria I'm using to decide who goes in here and who doesn't, to tell you the truth. It's based entirely off the vibes I get from a chapter, so what I consider obscure may in fact be something every other person in the fanbase is well aware of. Some of these guys are really lacking in pretty much anything though, so I can't imagine you'll take issue with some being called obscure. In fact, let's start with one of those more obscure chapters now. It's very hard to get more obscure than these guys. When I said some of these fellas are only in a White Dwarf article, I meant it. That and the book How to Paint Spehhs Muhrines at nearly the last page is all they got. The Emperor's shadows, according to what we can see, are samurai Spehhs Muhrines. And that, my friend, is technically still conjecture, because there are no unique weapons or anything modeled onto them to truly indicate they're samurai. All of their equipment is standard Imperial fare, but they have kanji and bonsai trees on their livery. Technically, they might not be samurai, but I don't think 40k is creative enough to have what's almost certainly the only Japanese-inspired chapter not just be samurai. Don't get me wrong, samurai Spehhs Muhrine should be a thing with some actual development, but it's also the low-hanging fruit, tasty though that fruit may be. Since the passage about them says their color scheme is based on the Black Templars, it's fairly reasonable to assume they come from Dorn's gene seed. It'd be not only fitting, since the Black Templars and Imperial Fist to a lesser extent are knights, and samurai are kinda like knights, but also more interesting than just saying they're White Scar successors because Japan and Mongolia are both in Asia. This is literally all there is about them though. They are not a very fleshed out chapter, or at all fleshed out. Them having Rogel Dorn's gene seed is a theory entirely born of them being based on the Templars' paint scheme. We're not exactly working with very much here. These are in fact Spehhs Muhrines, and not a special group of Sangheili zealots. Instead, the Guardians of the Covenant are a Spehhs Muhrine chapter descended from the Dark Angels and are stationed along the borders of the Halo Stars. At some point in the 41st millennium, they even held off an invasion largely by themselves against a species simply known as the Lelith. Not too much to go on it, although it does highlight how abysmal Imperial records are that no one knows exactly when that happened. Imagine this happening today, like the United States just forgot the year it declared independence because it didn't happen this century. They're Dark Angel successors, and their chapter icon is basically identical to the original Deathwing icon when the Dangels were still a legion, so it can be assumed they've still got plenty of deadly toys to play with. This is slightly at odds with the fact that their origins place them several millennia after the second founding, but it's not like the Dark Angels and their ilk don't regularly lie about things. You think a chapter's origins aren't something they'd also lie about? They probably just went, yeah, these are totally guys from the 16th founding or something. Yeah, sure. Ignore their iconography and all the oddly ancient weapons they have access to. The Guardians of the Covenant have a few things going for them, though I can't see why they're a background character faction. See, everyone in 40k has a thing, right? Especially Spehhs Muhrines. The Blood Angels are artists that sometimes go absolutely mental and think they're their dad. The Iron Hands are technophiles. The Raven Guard are sneaky. Even groups like the Ultramarines, that are in theory jacks of all trade, make that itself their thing, because they do it in a way only they really do. The Guardians of the Covenant, meanwhile, are perhaps one of the only chapters in the entire setting that don't just kneel before the altar of their Primarch and ignore everyone else. The Guardians of the Covenant are very studious fellas. So studious they have an ability in the Deathwatch RPG that essentially means they know a little bit about everything, ignoring especially forbidden lore or some such things like that. So studious, in fact, that on their chapter banners and more are passages of not only the Lion's teachings, but the Codex Astartes. Consider this: if you take all the best bits of the Primarchs and put them together, you'd get at least one functional human being. Maybe two, but at least one. The Guardians of the Covenant are seemingly some of the only people to realize this, and while they idolize the Lion, they realize that all of the Primarchs were exceptional in at least one field, and taking note of their teachings is a good idea. They also have a habit of recording, observing, and in general documenting every scrap of knowledge they can get their hands on. 40k is a dangerous place after all. Knowledge on how to fight the various threats of the galaxy can only help, and so there's little knowledge they'll leave untouched, which is very Thousand Sons of them. But if you think that's a pathway into darkness in the making, consider that they also have a group of themselves dedicated to burning potentially heretical knowledge any of their allies may have. They'll take a look through their comrades' libraries, take the knowledge so that someone still has it, and then to the fires with the original. This is very Space Wolf of them, although admittedly burning books isn't an uncommon thing in the world of 40k. And to top it all off, they show particular care towards the normal humans under them, even at risk to themselves. Throw the salamanders in with them, why not? This is why I imagine they're not too focused on. Them being a bargain bin of everyone else to some extent is fun, and if you were trying to make a Space Marine chapter that was logical, this would be a great way to do it. They keep the monastic charm because they're quite secretive even by the standards of the Dark Angels, but they do more than just worship the dude whose genes they had shoved into them. The issues are that not only does this potentially make them a little Mary Sue, it's also not very 40k. Everyone has their shtick for a variety of reasons, be that for narrative variety, or because 40k is an inherently unreasonable place. Sure, it'd be smart to take all the advice you can find, but the smart thing to do is not only rarely chosen here, but oftentimes outright declared as heretical around these parts. So these fellows who calmly accept any wisdom they can get their hands on, while also helping those weaker than them, don't quite fit the vibe, at least as the main characters. There's a level of paranoia and prejudice-filled war crimes you need to commit to be a contender for the spotlight in 40k, and these guys don't seem to me like they'd be good candidates for either. Still, they would be a cool chapter to have an army of. Much like Warhammer itself, if you copy enough things and jam them together, you get something resembling originality. So run a Deathwatch campaign with them if you can find those old source books. I imagine they'd either be a nice breath of fresh air for veterans or a way to ease newcomers into the setting. They're logical, well-read, kind-ish for Space Marines. Have one of them be a party mentor. Then have them killed, either to test if the party learned the lessons their mentor taught them, or to teach them the lesson that tolerance is the greatest heresy of all, depending on how grimdark you want to be. Did you know that we know all of the original first founding Space Marine legions? Truly, we do. As long as you don't mind dipping back into the wellspring of old lore that is Rogue Trader, which statistically, only roughly a third of you watching this have even a chance of having been alive for, if my analytics speak the truth. The Valedictors, alongside the rather more well-known Rainbow Warriors, are one of the original first founding legions, back when 40k was like, cool, and not a way for the man to make money, man. There really isn't much known on them, to the point that they only have the slightest bit more than the Emperor's Shadows, who only have a paint scheme to go off of. They were once upon a time a legion that was based on the eastern fringes of the galaxy. Now do you see this map here? You see the very edge past even Segmentum Ultima? That's where these guys were. If they were stationed any farther east, they'd be outside the Milky Way. In spite of being in the ass end of nowhere, they saw action against not only the Eldar and Orcs, but even the traitor forces of the Horus Heresy. Incidentally, this means that yes, the Horus Heresy was at least conceptually known about to the public, and we still knew who the first founding legions were in their entirety. It's a good answer to the question, why does GW change the lore so much? It's because they've always been doing that, and you just weren't alive for the first few changes. And that's pretty much it. Remember that this is Rogue Trader era lore we're talking about here. The Horus Heresy being GW's most milked-to-death cow hadn't yet become a thing, and it was instead still in the realm of myth and legend. Still, while canon has certainly left them behind, they're cool to look at as a historical part of Warhammer as a hobby. They're part of the setting's history when GW could just decide one of the original Space Marine chapters wasn't one of the original chapters anymore, and that was it. As one final fun fact, Latin to English on Google Translate says that Valedictor means farewell. If you'd like to be poignant, this accidentally becomes oh so accurate, and these guys are a farewell to the old style of Warhammer writing. If you'd like to get busy with the homebrew and bring these guys back either as your tabletop army or for a role-playing campaign, it can be significantly more badass. Say farewell to all those you know and love, because after the Valedictors come into town, you won't get a chance to see them again. You know Mini-Me from Austin Powers? That's the Genesis chapter for the Ultramarines. Now, some of you may think that's dismissive, and you'd be right, it is. These are still Space Marines, proud warriors of the Imperium of Man who can rip through normal people like butter. That doesn't make being dismissive of them any less correct. Something you may have noticed about 40k, even if you aren't that big into Space Marine stories like myself, is that the Ultramarines are involved in a whole lot of conflicts. Tyranids, orcs, chaos, that's just the tip of the iceberg of the opponents they've fought. Naturally, they incur plenty of casualties, because even if you fully buy into Space Marines being near unstoppable, you still have to accept that they take some losses, and yet they keep coming back for more. How is this, may you ask? Because either they have to be lax with recruiting standards, or the Ultramarines are breaking the codex their dad wrote and they have way more than 1,000 Marines. Turns out that the answer is sometimes a Genesis Marine will be promoted to Ultramarine. If the Ultramarines take a few too many casualties, or they can't afford to be short even a single Astartes, they'll grab a few Genesis Marines and fill in those gaps. Be it a librarian or your bog-standard battle brother, there's always a chance that the Ultramarine in question might have been loaned from elsewhere. Honestly, for as much as it is them not following the spirit of the Codex Astartes, I absolutely love that. It's both Roman-inspired, since Rome had plenty of battles where they lost thousands and came back with more legions, and funny bureaucracy stuff. Of course the legion born from the guy who could weaponize spreadsheets would find a way around a number limit. They just needed one singular chapter to be down for filling in their empty spots, and truth be told, that's probably a legitimate honor. For all that it is them poaching Marines, those Marines get to become a member of one of the original Astartes legions. For the Genesis chapter itself, they're almost like Ultramarine fanboys. Even when they aren't being told to paint their red armor blue and switch teams, they regularly go on campaigns alongside the Blueberries, helping them against the various foes they face. When they aren't following around the Smurfs like an army of little brothers, they're still making sure that they're as close to the Codex Astartes as physically possible. They will debate any potential actions and doctrines to see if they're Codex compliant, and if they can't figure out if something is or isn't, they'll just go ask the Ultramarines to ensure they're in compliance with the parent chapter. It's almost adorable. That being said, I think they'd be willing to ignore pretty much any Codex deviations if Guilliman said it was okay. After all, they love the Ultramarines, and Guilliman as their Primarch is the embodiment of the Ultramarines. If Grandpa Smurf says a certain action is okay, then I bet the Genesis Marines would be fine with it. Maybe they rationalize it as Guilliman writing the Codex Astartes means that anything he says is inherently Codex compliant. They did get into a scuffle with the Night Lords during the 13th Black Crusade, but even though they ultimately lost, they gave a good account of themselves and took down plenty of the cowards with them. Overall, while they are a chapter of Ultramarines at home, they still fit a great role in the franchise. Letting the Ultramarines fight in almost every single major battle without a valid explanation of how they're still around makes them the ultimate author's pets. With the Genesis chapter's existence, this is handily solved. And while it does technically mean they're not Codex compliant, realistically this doesn't matter. There's plenty of chapters out there that aren't Codex compliant in the letter or spirit of the law, and aside from it just being kinda weird, there's no real reason why Marines can't shack up with another chapter for a bit. If nothing else, even if you think this entire thing is a pathetic excuse to break the Codex by the people who wrote it, they're still Space Marines. Calling a Genesis Marine a discount Ultramarine to his face is getting you the kind of beating that earns you a closed casket funeral. Another Ultramarine successor chapter, these guys are the answer to the question, what if instead of Space Marines being super soldiers that were semi-divine warriors, they were the least competent people in the setting? Or to put it another way, what if an Eldar fan was in charge of making Space Marine lore? As with most Ultramarine successor chapters, they love the Codex Astartes, with one exception however. When they deploy, they tend to just throw an entire company at bare minimum against threats. While I do think Marines are overestimated, even I can admit that an entire company of them will get a mission solved nicely. After all, 100 Spartans thrown onto a single objective would certainly solve most problems. Even if they all end up dying, like with the various batches of the Spartan 3s being thrown on suicide missions, they'd surely complete the mission. This strategy unfortunately makes the assumption that the super soldiers in question aren't ragingly incompetent. During the liberation of Antilles 4, one of their companies is overrun by the Black Legion, and they detonate their position to go down swinging. Unfortunately, the singular surviving scout marine that made it out couldn't take all of the gene seed with him, and the apothecary on hand was apparently an idiot and just left it hanging around. So a World Eater's apothecary grabbed some Avenging Son gene seed and used it to stabilize his warband with it. Now admittedly, this all just sounds rather unfortunate than making them totally incompetent. I'm not finished. During the battle for Archimedon, their third company was tasked with defending a spaceport. This proved to be a difficult task because it's a war zone, so instead they just decided to blow it up. Their chapter master wasn't exactly thrilled to hear about this, but instead of bringing the hammer down, he gave them a chance to redeem themselves by fighting on the planet of Helmabad, which had a bit of a civil war problem. Some traitors were trying to spread chaos of both the capitalized and uncapitalized variety. After a few months of fighting, they discovered that the planet wasn't very far off from a massive demon invasion. Instead of doing something heroic, like valiantly trying to defend the planet even in the face of death, or smart, like trying to gather reinforcements, wage guerrilla warfare, or something else like that, they chose the third option: abandon ship. So they all left, killing the chaplain when he tried to stop them, and delivered the planetary governor to the Chaos Cultists in exchange for safe travel off-world. And then, because this was obviously heresy of the highest order, they just took off for the Eye of Terror. They ran away from Chaos, and then because they're so cowardly and stupid, they just joined it right after. Instead of making at least a token effort to become renegade pirates but still fight demons, they started worshipping them. And no, we're not done. There was a campaign called the Harrowing of the Night Reapers. From the name, you'd think the Night Reapers would get harrowed. Fair enough, but it certainly wasn't by these morons. The Avenging Sons sent in 4 entire companies and all the equipment and supporting staff and ships that go with such a force. The Night Reapers Renegade chapter ambushed them, stole one of their ships, and forced whoever was left to retreat. But to me, the worst of all was the Taros campaign. The planet of Taros was secretly helping the Tau, and it naturally turned into one big ol' military campaign. The Avenging Sons land, and it was going smoothly. They landed with no issues, butchered their way to the governor's palace, and when they figured he was hiding in a crowd of people, they opened fire on the crowd. The Imperium are the good guys, remember? Anyways, they analyzed the remains of the crowd and found out that the governor not only wasn't there, but no one there was even remotely related to him. Then Tau Mantis started flying overhead, and they lost about 80 men after a 2-day battle, I believe it was. To be fair as possible, they bloodied the Tau back. To stop being fair, they lost several Terminators and a Dreadnought. They were outmaneuvered by the Tau, which I'm no Tau hater, that's completely fair, but also the PDF of the planet. The PDF. Do you know how incompetent you have to be made a fool of by the planetary defense forces in this setting? Sure, some planets have well-trained PDF, but a well-trained PDF means that by the time the guard or whoever else shows up to save the day, there's still a PDF left fighting. That isn't the bottom of the barrel, that's punching through the barrel and getting stuck in it. At this point, I'm just gonna assume their name comes from their desperate attempts to avenge the various losses they keep accumulating. People already forget the Iron Hands exist. I'm sorry, Iron Hands fans, but it's a regular thing people accidentally call you the Iron Warriors, and your Primarch dies before the Horus Heresy book hit the double digits. You are clearly not the favorite. And now we have a technically Iron Hand successor chapter, the Steel Confessors. The children of perhaps the least talked about Loyalist chapter, though I suppose it's a close competition between them and the Raven Guard on that front. The Steel Confessors were born out of the close relationship the Iron Hands and the Mechanicus have. One day there was a particularly rough battle against Chaos that the Mechanicus had to call on the Iron Hands to help them out with. The day was won, but both sides were absolutely decimated in the fighting. As a show of good faith between these two factions, the clans of the Iron Hands gifted the Mechanicus with Gene Seed, and the Mechanicus in turn devoted 3 entire Forge Worlds to helping them rebuild, as well as specialized tech priests. After such horrible fighting, the Mechanicus had an idea. We now have this Gene Seed, why don't we make Spehhs Muhrines loyal to us instead of the Imperium as a whole? That way they'd have their own super soldiers to act as a rapid response force against any potential threats, instead of waiting for the other ones to finally come help. And so they did just that, building their own own chapter. Of course, the Inquisition almost immediately caught wind of this and asked them what the hell they were doing, and they tried to get the High Lords to bring the hammer down for this blatant power grab. The High Lords, for once in their existence, actually used a bit of brain power, however, and simply said the Mechanicus had to relinquish them to the Imperium as a whole rather than keeping this chapter in their back pocket. They agreed, but they were bitter about it and so named the chapter the Steel Confessors. The Confessors then went on to become just another chapter of Spehhs Muhrines, albeit one with incredibly close ties to the Mechanicus still. As you can expect of an Iron Hand successor chapter created directly by the Mechanicus, the Steel Confessors have all sorts of high-tech gizmos, as well as plenty of vehicles to throw at their foes. They're all at least passingly good at handling machinery, they hate weakness and love replacing body parts with machinery, and most interestingly of all, they worship the Emperor as a god. Of course, they worship him as the Omnissiah, who achieved true omnipotent unity with the machine god when he sat on the golden throne, but that's still worshipping Big E as a deity. And of course, to complete the trinity, we have Ferrus Manus, who they worship as the closest a mortal can get to becoming one with the machine god. Since their creation was a bit of a politically turbulent affair, they were gifted the Forge World of Craxus IV as their chapter homeworld, which was in many ways perfect for them. As a Forge World, it was a Mechanicus haven, so they could still be buddies with their creators, but it's still firmly imperial, so it won't bother anyone when they squat on it. And because it's on the eastern fringes of the galaxy, they were far enough away from the Imperium as a whole that they didn't have to worry about any Inquisitors deciding this chapter was still too much of a risk to allow to exist. It even had a cloaking device that made it appear like a barren rock to sensors scanning it, as well as its very own psychic choir to help boost the presence of the Astronomicon in the region. Unfortunately, the weather forecast one day called for total cloud coverage, acid rain, and an invasion by Hive Fleet Behemoth. Initially, the chapter master didn't consider them a threat, so he only called a few companies back to defend the homeworld at first. He probably regretted this choice around the time it was discovered that Tyranids don't have sensors, but rather an insatiable hunger that has evolved them to be able to track life wherever they go, and landed en masse. He definitely regretted it around the time he was being chopped into pieces by the millions of bioforms assaulting the planet, and what was left of the first company had to retreat. 2 entire companies were destroyed, with the rest suffering severe casualties and the chapter being reduced to less than half strength. Nevertheless, they were able to regroup and began rebuilding on the planet of Kalavaya, which they swore to protect. Presumably taking an interest in becoming exterminators, the future was one of surprising hope for a 40k army that was largely devoured by bugs. All of this lore makes them stand out a bit, and at least to me is cool, but you know what the funniest part about it is? All of this lore might be wrong. I could be telling you a complete fib on accident. This chapter's lore comes from a Games Day/Golden Demon event in Birmingham that happened in 2005 and heavily featured them. All of the information available comes from an Index Astartes article about them. The problem is, no one can find the original handout. You can find what's supposedly a faithful recreation of the article online, on a website that looks like it hasn't been updated since 2005, but the original source seems to have been lost to time. So all we have is the article recreation to take as the truth. We have pictures of their color scheme and pictures of a life-size Marine painted like them, so we know this thing happened, but their lore we are entirely taking this one article on faith for. And honestly, that's the most interesting thing about this chapter. The fact that for all we know, everything about them that's known is complete bullshit, because all we have to know about them boils down to one person going, "Dude, trust me," with what could very well be his own chapter's homebrew lore. It is endlessly funny to me that the best arguments against 40k being parody are the things that could perfectly fit into 40k like this happening in real life. God bless you, Steel Confessors. A part of me wishes that we never do see the original pamphlet of your lore, because this is a fun story to tell. The Halo Brethren are a group of Marines of unknown pretty much everything, including color scheme. They were part of the assault against the Eversor Assassin Temple alongside the Sable Swords and Imperial Fists, and we know nothing else about them. Artwork of them does not exist. Lore of them, aside from that single blurb, does not exist. You cannot get more on the sidelines than that. So why did I bother mentioning them? When there's this little to go off of, what is the possible point of bringing these guys up? Well, you see their name. Yeah, I like Halo a lot. What are you gonna do about it? As has been mentioned time and time again, the record-keeping of the Imperium is ass. If you have a document and you have the Administratum save it, I hope it wasn't important or you have a photographic memory, because that document is gone. This inability to keep anything written down properly is how we got the 13th founding of Spehhs Muhrines. This is known as the Dark Founding, but for once writers were able to keep the impulse to make 13 the bad number in check. It's not called the Dark Founding because of some terrible secret or tragedy that befell it. Nope, it's called the Dark Founding because no one has a fucking clue who came out of it. The records are all in the dark somewhere. I bet good money on the records still existing, they're just lost. Like in a really big library or under a really big pile of tax papers, who knows. We know the Death Specters came out of it, the Crimson Sabers / Crimson Slaughter, and these guys, the Exorcists. Created from the gene seed of Rogel Dorn, though they aren't told this until they become a part of the first company, the Exorcists are in a lot of ways no different from the rest of the various Codex-compliant Space Marine chapters. There is the slight exception that they have 2 extra scout companies, but that's about it. They hate the enemies of man, particularly Chaos, and will serve the Imperium as all Space Marines do. The key to their differences is of course in the name. During one battle, the Exorcists were out and about fighting demons. As brutal as you'd expect this to be, it only got worse when a Lord of Change possessed their chapter master, Enoch Trismegistus. This Marine, who I will call Tri from here on out because that name is a mouthful and a half, was actually able to awaken his latent psychic powers because of this, and called out to the chapter's chief librarian to help banish the demon. The day was saved, but naturally for such a catastrophic event as a demon invasion, the Inquisition took notice of the entire affair. Luckily, however, the faction of Inquisitors that found them were the Plutonians. TLDR, these guys believe that exorcising demons can and should be done as part of training, at least for elite soldiers like Space Marines. They interrogated Tri to hell and back, but when they found out he was not only pure, but seemed especially resistant to demons, they were over the moon. They proposed to Tri that if he had done this, surely his entire chapter could and should as well, and Tri agreed with them. So the Plutonians set up shop alongside the Exorcists and started jamming demons into them before helping them remove said demons. The result of this process is that the Exorcists as Marines are almost entirely invisible to demons. The only ones that could notice them are greater demons, and even then I would imagine you need a named one to really nail down where an Exorcist Marine is at any given moment. This has turned them into essentially an entire chapter of Grey Knights, allowing them to act against demons and even more mortal heretics with more effectiveness than anyone but the Grey Knights. And just to make sure their newfound Marines are worth their salt at killing demons, they have a damn demon world they use as training grounds. With a company of Grey Knights on standby, new recruits are tested at this planet to see how they do. If they do well, which to be frank I'm pretty sure just means survive, they pass and become a full-fledged battle brother. Now the question that may be in the back of your mind is that if these guys are so good at killing demons and can't even be seen by them, why don't they just make this standard practice? Well, a few reasons, and we'll go through the shallowest ones first. Though they are legitimately immune to further possession and corruption, they still mutate. The spirit may be willing and safe, but the body gains some scales and perhaps an extra arm. They remove these mutations when they come in, but more often than not, they just grow back. With the Imperium being as obsessed with the holy human form as it is, this wouldn't be accepted as standard practice for that reason alone. Their homeworld, called Banish because of course it is a dreary and barren place with only primitive humans living on it, and I imagine that's on purpose. Sure, it does mean they get hardier recruits, but it also means there's nothing of value for any tithe collectors to come asking for, letting the Exorcists stay hidden. The process is also an obviously incredibly dangerous thing. They are inviting a demon into their bodies to then be banished. The starting point of this is learning forbidden lore that can drive people mad. It drove an Inquisitor so mad when he saw the casualty rate of it that he took all the reject Marines that failed to pass and formed a Chaos Warband with them. They need to be like Goldilocks with this because too strong a demon and the candidate just dies or is permanently possessed. Too weak a demon and they don't get anything out of the process if they succeed. There's a reason the Exorcists have 2 extra scout companies, and it's not because they love the idea of Space Marine scouts. They have to have it because the process of creating an Exorcist Marine is so dangerous. It's naturally a very time-consuming process too, because the possession and exorcism only occurs after all the other trials and augmentations that go into a Space Marine have been completed. The aspirant might die on the table at the last hurdle, and now you've wasted years of time and resources on this dead dude. Let's say it works though. Congratulations, you have the most traumatized Marine around. He's a Space Marine, so he can still probably work through it, but some of that trauma is a lingering attitude based on the demon that was jammed inside of him. Korn, Slanesh, Nurgle, Zinch, hell, maybe there's a Marine out there that really likes cheese because someone shoved a vermin lore that got lost inside of him. The chapter has also formed something eerily reminiscent of the warrior lodges from the Luna Wolves before they were traitors, which is a sentence I hope worries you. To be fair, this is more of a coping mechanism than anything, and has as a result helped them become proficient in all sorts of tactics as they seemingly try to distract themselves from their semi-cursed existence. They're called the Orisons, and they go over all sorts of different tactics and whatnot to ensure these fellows are never caught flat-footed. flat-footed. In spite of them being geared towards demons, they're still Space Marines. While I'd still say the Grey Knights are better against demons than the Exorcists, I'd wager the Exorcists are better against everyone else. The gear is obviously worse for the Marines, but the tactics they use are varied and can be applied to various different enemies. They're even somewhat resistant to non-demon psychers, sort of like mini blanks, which would mean if nothing else they're great against demons and the Eldar. The Grey Knights, meanwhile, are geared towards demons, so they aren't fighting optimally if they're deployed elsewhere. The Exorcists certainly aren't loved, at least in-universe. Plenty of others have and would call them heretical if they knew of their existence, and it's easy to see why. It takes one incident where things go catastrophically wrong during the exorcism of a demon for the entire chapter to get wiped, or at least the system they're in to fall to chaos. But they're unique, fun, and flesh out the setting that much more through their presence. Also, they look like loyalist word-bearers, which is fun. For real, they have the exact same color scheme as the word-bearers did, and you gotta admit their icon looks at least a little demonic with those horns. Tempting fate a bit much, aren't we, lads? There's more chapters out there, plenty more, but those are the ones that I wanted to talk about. Now, for most of you, feel free to skip ahead, video's just about over, but I'd like to take a moment to soapbox a little bit. In conversations with others, something I and plenty others often hear are complaints that someone's favorite faction isn't getting updated. That's fair, and I mean hell, I've done that plenty, whenever I mention the Eldar, in fact. But a much less fair complaint I've heard is against certain factions getting updated because it means theirs isn't getting the update. And a very related complaint is people wondering why something exists. Why this army needs to exist, why this chapter even exists, as if the presence of them in lore and sometimes tabletop is a waste of space. I think that's the wrong attitude to take. If you take away anything from this video besides there's a whole lot of Marine chapters out there, I hope you take away that all these small background chapters, and indeed some armies that don't get much prominence, aren't wastes of space. They flesh out the setting, make it feel like an actual universe that's lived in and is always moving. The time it took to write paragraphs about these different chapters shouldn't be looked on as time that should have been spent talking about the Ultramarines or some Primarch or the other. All these background fellows make 40k feel full and interesting. If it was only the quote-unquote main characters, it wouldn't feel like a proper universe, it'd feel more like a soap opera about the world's most powerful dysfunctional family. Don't ask, why does this chapter exist? Don't complain when a different army gets an update and yours doesn't. Not every time, at least. Sometimes that's valid. Celebrate that the universe of 40k is that much more full, and the tabletop game has that many more options. Because if nothing else, all these background fellows are another way to paint your army and tell some stories with your friends about your games of Warhammer. Thanks for watching, and if you stuck around for that, I hope you take it to heart. Or call me a bitch in the comments for having feelings about things. And thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the background chapter of Spehhs Muhrines to my Warhammer 40k, filling out the roster and making the channel that much better. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. The 13th founding really is funny, though. Like, what do you mean you lost the founding? Go find it.